Treated to a musical program by Hal Gray, former music teacher at Rensselaer. Previous programs have included a musical at the Presbyterian Church and a Hoagie Carmichael music and life story last year at the Historical Society building. This year's program is in keeping with Armistice Day, time of the year, and is music and stories of World War II, both at home and abroad. At this time, I'll let Hal take over and give us this program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I started working on this about 6 months ago, and when I sit down to the typewriter, the words just flowed, the memories flowed. I can remember events that happened 50 years ago better than what last week. I don't suppose any of you are that old, but anyway. So since then, I edited my remarks. I'll try to speak loud, too. I hope you people in the back can hear it. I edited my remarks about 4 or 5 times, and so I cut it down to 33 pages from 82. Well, I've edited it several times since then. Even yet this morning I was cutting out some. There are so many things I would like to have said tonight, but this would have to be 2 or 3 different sessions. So I'm going to try to make it an entertaining evening for you. Now, about halfway through, I'm going to play a recording by the Andrews Sisters, the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and Company B. And at that time, if you will, and if you'd like to, during that recording, it's about 3 minutes because it's the old 78 RPM flat record, you know. Stand up and stretch a little bit because I know those chairs get hard. He's already said tonight about the ladies, fine ladies who have prepared. So with that, I'll begin, and on behalf of the Jasper County Historical Society, I do want to welcome you here tonight. Before I begin, I wonder if there are any veterans here. If you would please stand up. And if there's a Vietnam veteran or a Korean veteran, also please stand up. So you stand up to recognize. I wonder if there's any widows of veterans here tonight. Would you please also stand? Wives of veterans, would you please stand? Much focus has been placed on World War II this year, inasmuch as the 50th anniversary of the end of the conflict. Just this year alone, I have noted about and read about several things, and I'd like to mention some of them. The TV stations have been showing all of the World War II movies. Even the cartoons got into the spirit. I saw one Bugs Bunny where he was doing in the Japanese Air Force, and Mickey Mouse and his friends where he was selling war bonds. Then on February the 15th, I read an article in the Indianapolis Star where a P-47 Thunderbolt was raised from the Rensselaer Island Sea by the Dutch Army. They think that the body in the plane will solve the mystery of a 24-year-old pilot, Frank Gallion, who went down in that area and was missing in action in 1943. I never saw a follow-up on that story, but it would have been interesting had I seen that. The Clinton administration then redubbed VJ Day into the war in the Pacific. Well, it's still VJ Day to me, victory over Japan. They were afraid that they might offend the Prime Minister Murayama when he attended the ceremonies in Hawaii in August. Well, that wouldn't have worried me too much either. There was a fellow in Connecticut who was born on VJ Day, and in honor of that day, his father named him Victor John French, VJ French. Well, when they redubbed that as the end of the war in the Pacific, Victor John said, "Oh, they've taken my day away." Then on April the 18th, I read where there was a ceremony honoring the war correspondent Ernie Pyle in Dana, Indiana. He was killed by a sniper on the island of Ishima on that date, April date in 1945. Then President Clinton celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe, in Moscow, and he was accused of the French and the English of slighting them. See, old national rivalries, even after hundreds of years, are still very much at war. Then I read an article where the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki issued a statement that the United States had committed one of the two greatest war crimes against humanity by the use of the atom bomb. The other war crime was the Holocaust. Well, they claimed to kill civilians should not be an excuse for the loss of military personnel. As far as I'm concerned, the loss of anyone in war is a crime against humanity, and I'm not too much worried about the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Last year, I read an account of injuries of unexploded bombs in both Berlin and London when they were doing excavations on new buildings. And then there was the ceremonies held in Dresden, Germany, marking the destruction of that city on February the 13th and 14th, 1945. With a death toll of 35,000 civilians. Two formations of British Lancasters bombed the city on the night of February the 13th, followed by B-17s the next day. Dresden was known as the Florence of the North, and the people there have argued for 5 decades the morality of bombing that city because it had no military significance. They hold the British firebombing as a war crime. The British simply answer by saying, "Remember Coventry." Then there was a celebration of the Tate Remagen Bridge across the Rhine. It was the first crossing of the Rhine by the American forces. The Americans thought that it would be gone when they arrived, but the German explosives failed to fall it. Well, there were many veterans of both the American Army and the German Army at that ceremony. Then in March, there was a celebration of the remembering the invasion of Iwo Jima. Of the 22,000 Japanese that defended that island, only 1,083 survived. And there were 6,821 Marines killed, more than any single battle of World War II. Then there was commemoration on April 11th of the liberation of the Buchenwald death camp, where 556,000 people met their end. General Patton was so disgusted that he ordered all the people of nearby Weimar to come and witness the victims. Then many of you probably watched on CNN the elaborate celebration of VE Day in Moscow and Paris and London. And finally, some of you, I attended most of them, I didn't get to all of them, attended the St. Joseph Teaching Fellows on World War II. And I think they did a nice job in partnership with Prairie Arts Council. That's better. Now, I decided to approach this subject a bit different this year than has been approached before. So I've entitled it World War II, the Home Front, the Armed Service Front, and the Music of Both. There is no light side to war, and I would like to emphasize this point. However, there is a lighter side to the times, and once I have completed this introduction, I will not refer again to the tragic consequences of battle. I hope I can make an enjoyable evening with you, reminiscing about my experiences at home and in uniform. Now, I do not agree at all with the famous general that said, "God, I love the smell of battle." If you have ever seen whole cities laid waste, if you have ever visited an Army Graves Registration unit and saw hundreds of bodies lined up being prepared for burial, if you've ever seen grown, intelligent men lined up shooting at each other through no cause of their own, if you've ever seen children fishing in garbage cans in search for food, and if you've ever seen displaced persons roaming to find a secure place to live, or if you've ever lost a loved one, I'm sure you would say there is no light side to war. I've had all the 4 experiences, except I never lost a loved one to war, but Marcia did. She lost not only a cousin, but a brother. God, I love the smell of battle. Well, I don't think so. Now it is 50 years since the close of the war, and it seems as though it was only yesterday, and make one's ask himself, where's all the time gone, and so quickly? I can remember, as I said a minute ago, events from 50 years ago better than what I did last week. But since then, the time has rushed by and much has happened to me and to yourselves. Each one of you can think in your own mind what's happened to you during this long period of time, the loved ones you've lost, your marriages, the good times, the bad, the happy times, the sad, your employment, your vacations, your children, your grandchildren, and Beth, your great-grandchildren. And the memories galore and what changes. Incidentally, Marcia and I have 4 beautiful grandchildren, and if you'd like to stop by the house sometime, I have hundreds of photos and weeks worth of video. I assume that I'll probably have a line at my front door first thing in the morning. Now I speak about changes. Since World War II ended, my Army uniform has been up in my closet all these years. And something very strange happened. Something has caused it to shrink. I don't know. Have any of the rescue veterans had the same problem with shrinkage? Yeah. I'll get through this introduction in a minute.
160 to 260.
I'm going to ask George a question after a while, too, and I bet he can answer it. I am probably one of the youngest veterans of World War II because the first 2 years of the war I was still in high school, and the last 2 years of the war I was in the Army. Because of my interest in music, I decided to present this program tonight. The cost in human life was astronomical, for 17 million people lost their lives on the battlefield or the high seas. And that doesn't even take into consideration those missing in action and the wounded. Then there were 18 million civilians that died one way or another. The casualties were twice World War I, and they would have even been higher had it not been for the discovery of sulfa and penicillin and blood plasma transfusion. Equally depressing was the material losses. Direct military cost was read into the trillions of dollars, and property damage was twice this figure. Cities, transportation, roads, farmland was all obliterated. Whole structures of society were shattered, and it would take decades to find enough food, clothing, housing, and fuel to satisfy the survivors. I will only say that Germany, Japan, and Italy wanted victory, and all they got was defeat. Their great empires were gone. Of the 16 million that served in the United States Armed Forces, 1,078,674 never returned. In 1943, we had 5,000 American soldiers being killed each month. By 1944, this figure had gone up to 13,700 every month. And with the Normandy invasion, the casualties rose to 59,000 a month. And by December 1944, this figure had gone up to 81,000 a month. We had graves from Bastogne to Iwo Jima. Indiana contributed 338,000 men and women to the armed services, and over 10,000 were either killed or died in service. There were 1,407 that served from Jasper County, of which 16 never returned. My introduction is now over, and you're probably thinking to yourself, thank heavens, with all that darkness. As I stated at the beginning, there is no light side to war, but perhaps a lighter side to the time, and tonight, that is my focus.
We bring the world to order.
Bureau says he is the master ace. He Heil, and the Bureau space, not too long, sure. He's the greatest ace, so be Heil, and the Bureau space.
This is a very famous recording. Does anybody know who it was? Spike Jones and his City Slickers. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I and World War II brought us a wealth of music. Music is a powerful thing. It can bring tears to one's eyes when old memories are stirred. It can calm sad and lonely hearts. It can make tedious work tolerable. It can embody the history of one's region and country through folk music. One's sense of rhythm can be stirred to tap the feet and to dance. It can make a meal in a fancy restaurant more palatable. Of course, candlelight doesn't hurt either. It can stir one's excitement or relax a person to a restful afternoon's nap. Also, one's mind and spirit can be prepared for worship. Music has the power to inflame the emotions of patriotism. The great German philosopher Nietzsche, and I certainly agree with him, made the statement, wrote, "Life would be a mistake without music." And the Mexican composer Carlos Chavez once said, "I cannot live without music." Well, I think that might be putting it on a bit strong. However, I do believe life would be very dreary and colorless were it not for the fine arts. I fervently believe that the music of World War II, in part, helped America through those difficult years of 1941 to 1945. We had many silly songs during this period, and the youth of today might well say, and they criticize our music. Remember these songs? They made America smile even when their hearts were aching. I'm going to play just a little bit of 4 songs, and I expect the young people today would think that this first one here is by the King Sisters. This one always older than I thought they were. A little bit jumbled and jivey, sing merry oh, and oh, sing oh, and the little Ramsey Ivy. Merry dogs and dozy dogs, a little Ramsey Ivy, a gilly ivy do and you, a gilly ivy do and you. As for me, now Benny Goodman and his orchestra did this next one. Maybe I'll fool you this time. Martin with Eddie Stone singing. You remember this one?
In a town in Sweden by a
Here it is, Wayne.
some boys would set some fishing dream when they should have been in school. They couldn't read or write a word, but happiness they found in a little song they heard. Here's how it would sound. That's a Rollson on the river, and a roll suey. That's a Rollson on the river, and a roll suey. That's a Rollson on the river, and a roll suey. That's a Rollson on the river, and a roll suey. Now the Rollson is the sweetest town, the river runs.
And finally, the last one, Sandy K Orchestra.
Yeah.
I don't know the words of this one.
Once there lived a chicken who would say, chick, chick, all day. When that chick got sick and tired of just chick, chick, so one morning he started to say, chicory, chick, ta-la, check-a-la-rooney, in a banana, cabala, cabala, can't you see? Chicory, chick, chick, chicory, chick, ta-la, check-a-la-rooney, in a banana, cabala, cabala, can't you see? Chicory, chick is me. Every time you're sick and tired of just the same old thing.
I was raised during the heyday of the big bands. Their music helped homesick servicemen and lonesome sweethearts and parents through those war years. The big band era stretched from 1936 to 1946, and some authorities say clear up until 1948. But after the war, most of them just ceased to exist because television was becoming popular, and whereas we had been a population of listeners before the war, we became a generation of starers after the war. Then, too, there was new singers, new music. Frank Sinatra was wowing the Bobby Soxers. During the war, the gasoline ration had kept people at home. Before the war, it was common to drive 100 miles, dance all evening to some big band at a ballroom or a roadhouse, and then home the same night. But this all ended with a shortage of gasoline. Then draft boards needed replacements. I talked to Mamie Selby yesterday on the phone, and she had more of these than I did. I should have taken down her list. Draft boards needed replacements and entertainers, so by 1942, Artie Shaw, Orrin Tucker, I hope this audience is old enough to remember some of these names. Eddie Dutron, Claude Thornhill, Clyde McCoy, and Tex Beneke were all in the Navy. Glenn Miller and Larry Clinton joined the Air Force. Phil Harris and Ted Weems served in the Merchant Marines. Rudy Valley joined the Coast Guards, and Bob Crosby became a Marine. Another reason that lent itself to the demise of the big bands after the war was the fact that the government placed a 20% luxury tax on all dance halls. So many of them just closed, fell into disrepair, and were torn down. After the war, the big band pieces just wouldn't fit into place anymore. There were a few exceptions, however. So one casualty of the war were the big bands. It had been a marvelous era and produced more standards than any other time in the history of American music. They are now a part of the past and have become a fond memory for those fortunate enough to have been a part of it. I wouldn't at all be surprised if these songs were still around 50 years from now. Who can listen to the music without evoking a flood of memories? I'm going to play now what I think was the nicest arrangement that came out in the war. It's called I'll Walk Alone, and Dinah Shore singing. And incidentally, Dinah Shore just died last month, I think it was. There's very few of the old big band performers and singers left. But this is a nice arrangement. You can imagine, you know, if your boyfriend was going to service, how sad you'd be if you heard this song.
Because to tell you the truth,
Boy, Dinah could sing the anytime. teenage years, my mother would take me to Indianapolis, we'd shop. And before we would come home, every time we'd go to a movie at either the Old Lyric Theater or the Circle Theater. Arnold and I was talking about this tonight. Arnold lived down close to Indianapolis too. The Old Lyric Theater, with all of its beautiful marble and chandeliers, has been torn down and replaced by a parking garage. But thank heavens the Circle Theater, which after the war it fell into disrepair and it began showing X-rated movies and finally closed. But I'm happy for future generations that it has been restored to its old beautiful self and is now the home of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra. In between movies, the big bands would put on probably a 30 or 45-minute program. My mother and I tried to time it so we get there in time to see the big band, and then we'd watch the movie, and then we'd see them again on the second time through. And during that time there, and then in the heyday of, what do they call the beach over here in that day? Ideal Beach. In the heyday of the Ideal Beach, probably up until maybe 1953, 54, they had the big bands there. And between the two places, I think that I've seen the biggest share of the big bands. Now, in your pass-outs tonight, I have listed as many big bands as I could think of. I think I thought of 62, but I know there's some that I missed. Probably some of your favorites, and also the vocalists of the big bands. Well, let's begin our adventure in the past with what our life was like in 1940. Japan and Germany had a huge, well-trained Army, Navy, and Air Force, and were expanding their empires. Germany had workers from France and Belgium, foodstuffs from Denmark, oil from Romania, and grain and coal from Poland. Their pilfering in 1 year amounted to $36 billion worth of young men, machinery, horses, cattle, and grain. They made the historic looters, the Huns, the Vandals, and the Goths look like a bunch of pin money operators. They had their coastline fortified from Norway to Spain. General Marshall said how close the Japanese and Germans were for world domination. So let's take a look in Rensselaer in 1940. In January, Congress proposed a $500 million defense task and asked that the federal debt limit be raised to $50 billion. Now, in light of our debt limit at this time, you probably have a smile on your face. 55 years ago now, listen to this, Congress was talking about a balanced budget. Now I expect your smile probably will turn into a broad grin. In Rensselaer, Johnny Eddie Duchin Moore had a dance band. The Rensselaer Republican dubbed him that alias, Eddie Duchin. He had graduated from Rensselaer High School in 1933 and already has 6 years' experience as a drummer. We were reading in the nightly in the news about the Blitz in London, the fall of France, and Finland was fighting Russia for its life. It was a bleak outlook. In February of that 1940, George Grandpa Morgan celebrated his 92nd birthday. A week before, Ansel Woodworth passed away, and this left Grandpa Morgan, as they call him, the oldest Civil War veteran in the county. Mr. Morgan passed away 5 years later in 1945. The city schools, now get this. The city schools presented a music festival and it was reported to be a gay setting. Then the Rensselaer Republican reported that the 1940 prom was a gay affair. Oh, it's too bad they wrecked a perfectly beautiful word. The Senate tried 2 unsuccessful attempts to delay the conscription bill by 60 days. However, the Burke-Wadsworth conscription bill finally passed on September the 15th, 1940, and designated October the 16th as National Registration Day, requiring 16.5 million men to register. All men 18 to 35, now they played around with those ages quite a bit, but it finally boiled down to 18 to 35 were eligible for the call. And pay for an inductee was $21 a month. Washington, D.C. quickly vacated because the congressman wanted to get home and start campaigning for the election of 1940. In Jasper County, each precinct was to have a draft board with 1 registrar and 3 assistants. The chief supervisor was Frank Hardman. Now, some of you people are going to know these names and some of you won't. Frank Hardman, and the 3 general supervisors were the clerk of the county, Keith Spencer, I think he was from Remington, George Fate, and Leroy Kurtz. Members of the draft board would receive no pay, and rental for a place to meet was not allowed. There was a request that went out for volunteers to serve on the draft board to the American Legion, to the Legion Auxiliary, and to the 2 sororities in town, the Tri Kappas and the Sigma Phi Gammas. On October the 16th, 1,709 men registered in Jasper County. There is a story about the young man that reported for his physical examination, and the doctor asked him if he had any physical defects that would prevent him from serving the armed forces. And he replied, "Yes, sir, no guts." Exempted from the draft were those working in the war industry, those involved with agriculture, the clergy, hardship cases, and if a married man had a dependent. But however, if the married man's wife worked, he was eligible for the call. If a man was drafted, he would be given 5 days to settle his affairs before reporting for duty. This was later ignored. When I was called, I had my physical, such as it was, and I got no 5 days. I was transported to southern Indiana to Camp Atterbury. Each man in the county was assigned a number by a lottery. The lucky fellow that received number 1, this fellow was alive when I wrote this, Harold Jensen. He just passed away a short while ago. Ralph Fendig had 537, and that lucky Gordon Bosman came up with 1,583. However, all those fellows served finally. On October the 29th, Secretary of War Henry Stimson drew the first name out of the bowl, number out of the bowl. The lucky fellow to have his number drawn in this county was James Edward Steffel, that lived way up in Gillum Township. The first 2 volunteers from the county were Jack Abbott and Howard Beard, which released Mr. Steffel from the number 1 spot. However, he later served in the armed forces. I thought it might be interesting for you. I'm going to read through real quickly who were on the draft boards in the 5 precincts here in town. There are a few of these people still living, but not very many. Marion 1, Emmett LaRue was the chief registrar, and on his board was Edson Murray, Mrs. Jim Chapman, Mrs. Robert Tavy, Mrs. Louis Hass, and they met in the Legion Room. Now, I don't know where the Legion Room was in those days. Marion 2, Frank Hardman was the chief registrar, and on his board was George Warden, Mrs. Howard Randall, Betty Wright, Betty Wright's still living, Mabel Kreitzer, I don't know if Mabel's still living, yeah. And they met in the armory. Marion 3, Paul Arnott was the chief registrar, and I think Paul Arnott later went to the service, did he not? Okay, well, on his board was O.L. Humphreys. Maybe some of you remember Humphreys. Lola Mae McCoy, Mrs. Stan Bresnahan, and Mrs. Ian LaRue. And they met in the north half of the White Front Garage, which was located where the Rensselaer Republican now is. Marion 4, Emil Hanley was the chief registrar, and on his board was L.D. Hoshaw, who was the principal of the high school at that time and later served in the armed services. Mrs. J.E. Hopkins, Mrs. Waldo Garrigus, Miss Garrigus, she's still living, and Mary Myers. I don't know about Mary Myers. Yeah, no. And they met in the old Hotel McKeever. And finally, in Marion 5, Paul Carton was the chief registrar, and on his board was Arthur Battleday, Mrs. Helen Thompson, Mrs. Jim Townsend, and Mrs. Lloyd Seago. And it says that they met at the Green residence. Now, I don't know which Green that was. The Ames Food Market downtown was advertising all meat hamburger, 14 cents a pound, oleo, 8 cents a pound, pork and pork chops, 23 cents a pound. You could buy Jell-O for 5 cents a box. Coffee was 14 cents a pound. If you had a quarter, you could buy 3 cans of Campbell's pork and beans. The Palace Theater was charging an entry fee of 10 cents for a child and 15 cents for an adult ticket. Now, country singers got into that during this time too. I wrote down here the names of 5 songs. I don't know if if I'm talking over your head here or not. Tex Ritter, does Tex Ritter strike? Okay. He put out a song called Gold Star in the Window. And Elton Britt put out, you may not remember Elton Britt, but I bet you remember a song that he introduced. There's a Star Spangled Banner waving somewhere. And Gene Autry put out one called Mail Call Today. And Ernie Tubbs, he really got a sad song, The Soldier's Last Letter. Now, I'm going to do something tonight that I haven't done in the, I better get some water before I try this. That I haven't done in the 43 years that I've lived in Rensselaer. I'm going to sing a solo by myself. But you have to promise to applaud if I get the words halfway decent. I had forgotten all about this song. It was introduced by Red Poley. Now, Red Poley was one of the first ones on the old WLS Barn Dance, and one of the first ones that went down to Nashville at the Grand Ole Opry, and he is also in the Country Singers Hall of Fame. Of course, he's long since passed away now. But I had forgotten all about this song. It was called I'll Be Back in a Year. Until I saw the movie a while back, Biloxi Blues. Now at the end of it, where the credits started going by, the director, the hairdresser, whoever claimed the restroom, you know. Well, this song came on, I said, I've forgotten all about it. And I'm going to try to do it, but I might mess up. But remember, you've got to applaud. It was kind of a catchy little song, and that's why I'm doing it. I couldn't find a recording of it. Goodbye, dear, I'll be back in the year, 'cause I'm in the army now. They took my number out of the hat, and there's nothing a guy can do about that. And when I get back, I'll be Lieutenant Brown, and we'll buy that cottage just outside of town. So goodbye, dear, I'll be back in the year. Don't forget that I love you. Hold your applause. There's another verse. Goodbye, dear, I'll be back in the year. You can almost guess the name of this song, because I'm in the army now. Don't I look handsome, dressed up like this? Stop your crying and give your soldier a kiss. They may send me out to the old Philippines, but sweetheart, you'll still be the girl of my dreams. Oh, Marshall, dear. You know, for all the time I was in the service, Marcia didn't write me one single letter. Now that wasn't very nice, was it? So, goodbye, dear, I'll be back in the year. Don't forget that I love you. Your applause, we appreciate it. Well, tonight is a first. In 1940 and most of 41, Europe and Asia were being swallowed up by totalitarianism, and here at home, however, we felt secure. After all, we had the Pacific Ocean to our west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. Nobody could possibly invade us. And then, too, President Roosevelt had told us that he would keep us out of war and no American boy would ever have to serve. And his opponent, Republican opponent in 1940, Wendell Willkie, also stated, no dictator would dare attack America, and he promised to keep us out of war too. So whichever way they voted in 1940, you know you won there because they promised to keep us out of war. Well, too, there were still congressmen, however, in Washington that thought that we could live apart from the rest of the world. However, after World War II, you heard very little about isolationism. As Wendell Willkie's book said, we are one world. Well, added to all of this, we were still in a depression. There were few jobs. Money was short, and I still don't know where my mother found that 50 cents a week to pay for my piano lesson. After all, she could have gone down to Ames and bought 6 cans of Campbell's pork and beans. That might be an interesting discussion sometime for the teaching fellows to talk about the depression. It would be difficult for the present administration to understand life without television. It is said that television had made the imagination of today lazy. We all listen to our favorite radio programs, and we were each a director. We imagined the characters and probably what they looked like. And when the old Enter Sanctum thriller came on, perhaps some of you looked, when that creaking door opened, my hair would stand on end. Well, we also got to listen to the big band music every night in 15-minute segments, live from some ballroom all over the United States. Life was simple. I contracted to wash windows for a dozen stores downtown on Saturday. We played out of doors a lot. We walked to school or rode our bicycles if we could afford it. Came home for lunch, and we read a lot. Life was hard, but good. And sometimes I wonder if perhaps we weren't better off than the youth are of today. On December the 7th, however, our peaceful life came to an end with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Most of us didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, but it changed our lives for the next 4 years, oftentimes fearful, tragic years. With 384 fighters and bombers, the Japanese Empire marched into the conflict. We were at war. Here's a famous recording by Sandy Kaye.
History in every century records an act that lives forevermore. We'll recall, as into mind we fall, the thing that happened on the Hawaii shore. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go through each subfloor. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo. We will always remember how they died for liberty. Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory.
Power in it. Here's Ruth up here tapping her foot.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo. We will always remember how they died for liberty. Let's remember
record in those days, but most of them didn't last as long. America quickly mobilized and became an industrial giant among nations. During the war years, they produced 28 million gross tons of ships. Now that's all literally a bridge across the Atlantic. 296,000 planes, 87,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 17.5 million rifles, 315,000 pieces of field artillery, and 4.5 million tons of artillery shells. But it was a costly process. By the end of the war, the national debt had gone from 50 billion to 250 billion. The annual budget rose from 10 billion to 100 billion. Before the war, 90% of the revenue went for civilian use. By the end of the war, it had exactly reversed. Well, I'm going to skip that part. Almost immediately, because I will say, my sister was married on June the 1st, 1941, and my brother went to the Air Force the next day. To say the least, my mother was not a happy person. Almost immediately, because of the demand for food and clothing for the fighting machine, we were introduced to rationing. Tires, sugar, gasoline, meat, fats, oil, butter, cheese, processed food, and shoes were all on the scarce list. And if you were influential enough to buy an automobile, you remember all that shiny chrome disappeared for that muddy-looking yellow plastic down the side. The Office of Price Administration issued ration books and would periodically state what each stamp would allow one to buy. Fats were used in the production of explosives, and so housewives were encouraged to save all the fat and turn it into the grocery store. I remember one grocery store had a big sign in the window that said, "Ladies, bring your fat cans in here." Here in Rensselaer, our high school yearbook is known as the Chaos. In my hometown of Tipton, Indiana, it was known as, Katie? The Tiptonian. See, Katie graduated down there too. In the Tiptonian of 1942, a friend of mine, Joe Neary, wrote, perhaps Katie knew Joe Neary, I don't know. But here's a little poem that Joe wrote in that 1942 Tiptonian. First they took our nylon hose and then our gasoline. Now they've rationed sugar. Think what that will mean. Watch the excess pounds roll off. The hefty folks get slimmer. A nip and tuck in clothes too large will give each stout gal's glamour. Rubber now is a luxury, but it really doesn't matter. For with sugar gone, now lines will be the kind to make hearts happy. In that same yearbook, the faculty were known as the big guns. The seniors were known as the non-coms, and we underclassmen, you know what we were called, buck privates. We organized a victory corps that did such things as sell war bonds and stamps. In 2 years, we sold $42,000 worth of war bonds. We gathered scrap metal for the war effort. And we also corresponded with a sister town in England, Tipton, England, Tipton, Indiana. And it was interesting to us to know that even as late as the early 1940s, people in Europe still thought we were a land of cowboys and Indians, and that we all rode around in limousines over here. Well, we had a minister in our town by the name of Urban Ogden, and he was what was known as a conscientious objector. Now that was fine and good, but if anyone had anyone in service, that was a dirty word to them. I remember Reverend Ogden took us to a conscientious objectors camp one time. Can't remember exactly where it was anymore, but it was either near Peru or Logansport. And I can remember clearly my thoughts as I saw the fellows playing ping pong in a recreation hall. Yellow bellies, I thought. However, during my overseas duty, I had a change of mind, because many of them served meritoriously in the medical corps. Sometimes intolerance, oftentimes, causes a lot of misconceptions. One Sunday, Reverend Ogden stated in the pulpit that the prayers of the church would not go with the boys in the service. Well, now that was the wrong thing to say. I had a great aunt in the church. I can still see her. She always sat in the back pew on the left-hand side. And she was one of those people they called the pillars of the church. You know, if the doors were open, she was there. Well, when the good Reverend made that statement in the pulpit, she stood up. Everybody wondered what she was going to do. And she stared him straight in the face, and she walked out on him. Well, needless to say, Reverend Ogden didn't last long in the Tipton church. 2, there was the black market. Regardless of where you were, if there was a profit to be made, there was someone there to make it. If you had the money, one could buy tires, or sugar, or meat, or etc., etc. Scarcity seems to bring out the worst in people. If an item is scarce to come by, There are those that must have it, even if they don't need it. My mother, a bit dry here. My mother had a friend who was always first in line at the grocery store to get the loaf of bread before it was sold out. And when the war was over, in her attic she had stored huge amounts of coffee and sugar that she had purchased and never had any use for. She had the nerve to go down to the grocer and ask him if he would buy it back. I'm happy to tell you tonight he flatly refused. Hoarders added to the problem of shortage during the Second World War. Now, one thing that we did, we all listened to radio, the news nightly. I'm going to let you hear a little clip of a news release on October the 21st, 1944. This is the CBS network.
World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of Admiral distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards. The world heard indirectly from Hitler for the first time in 17 weeks today. He didn't broadcast, but he issued a proclamation containing all the old Nazi diatribes and claims that victory for Germany is certain, with the preservation of Germans of first importance. At the same time, the German Volkssturm, the People's Army, swore allegiance to the Fuhrer and pledged unconditional resistance to the Allies. Reich's Minister Goebbels spoke at the ceremonies and said regiments of the People's Army would be used to bolster any critical section of the front. On the battlefields, American troops are making fresh gains in the fight for Metz. The Russians were reported to have crossed the Danube near Budapest, and the Japs have taken another beating in the trying to reinforce Leyte. And now, news sent direct from overseas. Admiral takes you to CBS Paris. Larry Lasseur reporting.
The Battle of Lorraine flamed more fiercely when the Germans hurled tanks at General Patton's doughboys for the first time since the Third Army fought.
The last summer that I was a civilian, my last full summer that is, that's between my junior and senior in high school, I worked on a farm, and the fellow I worked for was what was known in those days as a draft dodger. Before the war, he had a very lucrative grocery store. In fact, he kept it all through the war. And but that wasn't going to keep him out of the Army, and so he had a mother that was very well off financially. And she drove over from southern Illinois, and she bought him 180 acres of the finest Tippin County farmland that was for sale. He didn't do any of the work, but in the many trips to the draft board in southern Illinois, he must have convinced him that he did. He had 2 full-time employees plus myself. I lived with them during the week, and they were very nice to me, and the lady was an excellent cook. I helped do such things as plant tomatoes, plowed, helped with the dairy cows, hauled tomatoes to the cannery in Elwood, and put up hay. In thinking back, it scares me a little bit. A 17-year-old kid driving that huge truck, that 15 miles or so, to the cannery. But I never had a mishap. Now, his farm was divided into 2 squares of 80 acres each, and they were joined at the corner by a rickety bridge across the creek. And when I drive across that bridge, very slowly I might add, I could hear the beams under there creaking and cracking. However, believe it or not, it never gave way. Just down the road, 2 miles from the farm that I worked on, there was a German prisoner of war camp. It was kind of like a tent city. And they would bring the under-armed guard, bring the German soldiers down once in a while to do such things as hoe weeds out of the tomatoes. Now, we weren't allowed to talk to them, and I can remember that I looked at them with a great deal of disdain. However, you know, when age creeps up on you, in retrospect, I expect those fellows were pretty scared. There they were, thousands of miles from home, an ocean in between, and they probably wondered if they'd ever see their loved ones again. So again, you know, sometimes when you jump to conclusions, you come up with the wrong answers. When I graduated from high school, the war effort was still not going well, and so I knew my time as a civilian was limited. So to pass time, I got a job at a perfect circle piston ring factory. I was supposed to run 2 lathes and a cutter all at the same time I never got too good at it. And I've often joked about, I wonder how many planes went down the South Pacific during the war because of the piston rings that I made. But anyway, across the aisle from me, there were lots and lots of ladies working. In fact, my mother worked there, and then I had an aunt whose husband was in the Navy, worked over there. One of the women one day, while I was sitting around in the circle eating lunch, made this statement. She had no children. "I only hope the war lasts long enough so we can get our house paid for." Well, this was the wrong thing to say, because from that time on, the poor lady had no one to talk to at the factory. To pass the time, you know, like I said, we had no gasoline to go anyplace. There were 12 people that went to our church. They were all a lot older than me. They were all married except just one other fellow. And I think the reason they asked me along was because I could play the piano. But they would meet at one of their houses every Saturday night, and we would have a recording session. One person had a recorder. Now, not the fancy tape kind, you know. This was the old disc. One person had to watch the view meter to be sure that the signal was just right, and another one had to put the stylus down on the needle on the record and then keep brushing the shavings out of the way all the way through. We did such things as told jokes, read poems, sang songs, and we passed more time that way. Well, I'm preparing for this program. I knew I had some of these records down in my basement. So I went down, and all the little 7-inch cardboards were so cracked they were inaudible. The glass records, most of the shellac had peeled off of them from the years past, and many of them were broken and cracked. But I finally resurrected 2 old metal records, and I'm going to let you hear tonight. These were recorded in 1942. Now, in this first little clip here, I am pretending like I'm a man on the street, and I'm interviewing people. Now, you understand, this is all ad-lib. Of those 12, however, that was in that group, there are only 3 of us living now. These 2 that I'm talking to, Jerry and Pete Persinger, were peaches people. They later moved to Florida, and they are both passed away now. But they were fun-loving. All right, here's the recording.
This is Master Footcloth, Storage Radio Station down here on the corner of 56th Avenue. We're asking a few of the people of the places here to say a few of these words. Well, hello, mister. What's your name? Could you tell us a little? Ain't got none. Ain't got none. What do you mean you got none? I lost it. Where'd you lose it? On the street. I think you're crazy as that, kid. What's the matter with you? I'm crazy. What's your occupation? WCA. WCA. I know that one out. I forgot. You did? Where'd you go? Out. Out? Out where? Out on your life?
Yeah, that is.
I still How crazy is that, guys? We're crazy. Are you ready?
Mister, I use your products. I think they're wonderful.
Madam, what is our product? What is it?
Oh, that slippy, slimy soap is just wonderful. Look at my hand. Oh, my husband says my hand is just beautiful. Now, isn't it wonderful?
Sister, what's the matter with your eyes? You fall in the bathtub on it? So sorry.
Wish I could turn this off here now.
Yep, there. What you married for? That's what I like to know. Who's you married? Some old hag. Yeah. You don't need to rhyme. Yeah, why? You rhyme. Yeah, you need to rhyme. Yeah, that'll hag. Oh, that one. Yeah, that one. That's it. That's the tenth one. I still think you're crazy. Moving on down to, well, see you tomorrow at the same time for Max Footcloth and his magical Cookie Finest Ghost. Brought in front of
They told me the record was ended. I'm just going to play about 15 seconds more here. This fella is singing the Little Brown Jug, and you'll hear me join in on the end.
Oh, white and down, all alone, a little brown one we call our own. He loves this and I love brown. Everyone just have fun. You and me, little brown jug, girl, I love you. You and me, little brown jug, girl, I love thee.
I don't have this in my notes, but I got to tell you one amusing story. The fellow you heard there, he died about 10 years ago. His name was Colin. He was a chemical engineer, and he had a plant at the edge of Tipton. You probably knew Colin Pence, did you? He had a plant at the edge of Tipton. He made some sort of a secret medicine for the Army. All I know is that he imported some sort of a plant from Egypt to go into this. Well, anyway, we got in our heads that we wanted to drive to Cincinnati to see a ball game at the old Crosley Field down there. He said, not to worry. I'll go out to the plant and I'll mix up some gasoline. So we went out to the plant. Just as the war came on, he bought a beautiful 1941 four-door sedan Buick. And so the day came, and he poured his homemade gasoline in there and put enough in the trunk to get us back. So we were off. Car ran beautiful, boy. We zipped on down to Cincinnati. We saw a ball game, and then afterward, why, we stopped in at that fancy hotel on that time, the Netherland Plaza. But they wouldn't let us in. Of course, we had no suit, no coat or tie. So after dining in a little beanery somewhere, we were off to home. It was getting late by this time. We got about 10 miles north of Cincinnati to a town called Hamilton, Ohio. I still remember that town. And the car began to chugging and spittered and sputtered, and finally it stopped. Well, we messed around there for the best part of 2 hours and finally got it going again. And it did this all the way home. We didn't think we'd make it. In fact, we didn't get home till it was just getting daybreak. Well, that same day, he took his car into the Buick garage, and when they opened up the motor, it was coated with a slimy goo that resembled green molasses. And when they pulled the piston out of the cylinder, great hunks of this slime came down. Well, to say the least, this was the end of his petroleum day. Just a short time after I turned 18, I received that dreaded letter from President Roosevelt. It said, "Greetings, we would sure love to have you in the service." Well, I climbed aboard a bus on the courthouse square on a cold morning. It took me to Indianapolis to the old National Guard Armory out on Madison Avenue. A few years back, we were out that way, and the building's still there. What it's used for, I don't know. You've ever heard of famous last words? My eye doctor told my mother, "They'll never take this boy. His eyes are too bad." Well, it wasn't long till we found ourselves taking the oath of the Army, and as far as I knew, no one flunked that physical that day, and they transported us down to Camp Atterbury near Edinburgh, Indiana. Now this was quite a culture shock for me. I had it pretty good as a kid. I had 3 square meals a day. I had a room of my own and a doting mother to take care of it. Why, I could even turn the alarm off in the morning and saunter off downstairs where a nice warm breakfast was waiting for me, and no one hollered at me. You've heard 2 sayings. There's a right way and a wrong way and an army way. And also, the army will either make you or break you, and I will say, how true. The first person we met was a semi-literate corporal who had the disposition of a mistreated Doberman Pinscher with a thorn in his paw and an empty water bowl. He alone decided when I went to bed, when I got up, when I ran, when I walked, the very placement of my eyeball. Straight ahead, soldier. He alone decided what terrible punishment fit our minor transgressions, and he alone decided if our bunk was made tight enough to bounce a quarter, high enough. Also, if our barracks met operating standards of cleanliness. He also, I no longer had fear of going to hell for my sins, because I had gone right through hell, and now I was at the mercy of this lowly corporal. The price for resisting any of his orders was simply more than any sane person was willing to pay. Endless laps around the parade ground, hours marching on the oval track. There was the honor standing weekend guard, and the 16-hour hitch in the kitchen starting at 3:30 in the morning. One fellow had to go into the kitchen at 3:30 in the morning, and the mess sergeant escorted him to a mountain of potatoes and handed him a knife. he said to the mess sergeant, "Surely, Sarge, in this day and age you have machines to do this." And he says, "We do, and you're the latest model." The Army won big, it won, of course. 50 years later, I still do things the Army way. I sort all my socks together. I still make my bed with hospital corners. All my hangers are going the same direction. Besides, it's safer that way. I just never know when that vile-tempered, hoarse voice, dirt-mouthed corporal from Camp Barry might just stop by my house for a surprise inspection. Why take a chance? I have often wondered what that guy did after the war. Here's the question I'm going to ask you, George. I said my Army serial number so many times, I still know it after 50 years. 359-64472. What's your number?
0361253.
I told you. With such abuse, one of the fellows turned to me and said, "If they treat us this way, I wonder how they treat the enemy." Now then, I'm to the place where the Andrews sisters are going to sing, and if you'd like to stand up in place, I'd appreciate you just staying in place because I'll try to wind up as fast as possible. I do want to play some on the piano for you before the evening's over and make some remarks about it. I may jump here and there and jump over some of this because I see my time is getting away. Now, the Andrews sisters were a big group during the war on all the jukeboxes, and they must have put out millions and millions of records. There were three of them, Patty, Maxine, and Laverne. Is that right? No, yeah, Patty, Laverne, and Maxine. Now, Laverne died in 1967, and Maxine died just last month. Her last public appearance was for the celebration of VJ Day out in Hawaii when President Clinton and the Prime Minister of Japan was there. And Patty is still living. All right, this is kind of hard to say. Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. All right, if you'd like to stand up, it'd be about 3 minutes. rations. I wish I had brought some things, but there were two kinds of rations that we had here and overseas. One was called sea rations. They were in a can, looked like, sort of like a peanut can, if you see them at the store. They were olive drab in color. They had a key on the bottom, you could open it. And such things as ham and beans, I remember, and beef stew. Not too palatable, but, you know, nourishing. Hash, oh yeah.
Vegetable stew and meat and beans.
All right, see, George had eaten some of it. One smart fellow drove a truck and said his sea rations on his motor one time and started with, yeah, on the manifold, and it warmed it up. Unfortunately, I didn't have a truck. Then there was the K rations. They looked about like a Cracker Jack box, only maybe a little larger. They had such things as maybe 3 or 4 cigarettes, candy bar, crackers and cheese. Was there any meat in there?
It's a little can, little round can, about half the size of a tuna fish can.
Okay, and then after they packed it, they dip it in a greenish wax, so that when you ate it, you had to peel the wax. Well, that would keep it from perishing. There's this.
That was burn and warm it with.
Oh, you're supposed to burn it? Lieutenant Matthew E. Ritchie. Two soldiers were sitting in their foxhole and they had their K rations, this box that George and I are talking about. And one fellow held his against his chest and reverently bowed his head and said his prayer in thanksgiving for this bundle of food. When he finally raised his head, the other fellow said, "Aha! Your prayers weren't answered. The K rations are still there." Then we love to complain in the Army. I don't know about George's out there or some of the rest of you, but complain about everything. One fella came home from on furlough, and his mother had been the kind who organized her correspondence for years. Such things as she had all of her husband's love letters before they were married in nice ribbon, and wedding announcements and birth announcements. And he noticed that when she got home, she had all of his letters in 2 nice stacks, all tied up with twine. And he said, "What's this for, Mother?" She says, "The first stack is where you complain about the food, and the second stack is where you complain about everything else." Really, the Army food wasn't that bad. It just simply wasn't what Mother cooked, of course. Now, I got along fairly well on that first song. There's another song about Army food, and this has about 15 verses, but I'm only going to do a couple of them. The biscuits in the Army, they say they're mighty fine, but one rolled off the table and killed a pound of corn. Oh, I had had enough of Army life. Gee, Ma, I want to go. Hey, Ma, I gotta go. Gee, Ma, I want to go home. Then there's one about the Army coffee, too. I was talking to somebody about Army coffee a while ago. Who was it? Well, it's something else, anyway. The coffee in the Army, they say, is mighty fine. It looks like mud and water, and tastes like iodine, and so forth. Well, we arrived at our basic training camp in Camp Fannin, Texas. It's just outside Tyler. I made this statement one time in front of a crowd, and there was a true Texan there, and she was very offended. So I hope that there's no true Texans here tonight, because that place was a godforsaken hole of scrub brush, red clay, and sand. The Army must have condemned it because outside of camp there were houses and churches and even little towns, and they were all deserted. Nobody was even around. Well, I was going to discuss basic training, but I'm going to skip over because I see my time's gone away. Now, there were other people from Rensselaer that had association with Camp Fannin. Kenneth Wiseman took his training at that camp. Gerald Pettit got his discharge there. And Colonel Mackey started out his basic training there. I talked to Colonel Mackey on the phone a few weeks ago, and discussed Camp Phantom with him. He says, "Oh, so you had to crawl through those tangles too, huh?" When I entered the Army, I weighed 205 pounds, and 12 weeks later, 3 months later, I weighed 170 pounds. They like to kill me. But in retrospect, I imagine that they were just trying to save my life. It was miserable. There were things I'd rather have done. When we finished, I have here one amusing story. One fellow found a little glass bottle, and he filled it full of that red Texas clay. He sent it home to his wife with a note saying, "Even though we're 1,000 miles apart, you can still worship the ground I walk on." When we finished basic training, and I'm going to try to wind this up pretty fast now, because all of this stuff was pretty well covered in those 7 sessions of, I'll go through that real fast when I get to it. We knew that there was no doubt of where we were going because we were ordered to Fort Meade, Maryland. And we boarded the pre-war luxury ship, the New Amsterdam. It was at that time the 5th largest ship in the world. A few years back, Lenny Bird and Harold Sage took a trip to Europe, and they went over on the New Amsterdam. Of course, I'm sure it didn't look anything at all like when the troops were on it. And she sent me a postcard, a picture of that boat. There were 5,000 of us on there, and we heard that earlier in the war there had been 10,000. 5,000 slept while the other 5,000 walked the decks, and then vice versa. We were 5 days at sea, and you can't believe that it was a beautiful, beautiful sunny, warm weather. And it's difficult to believe, but the ocean was as flat as this floor, all the way across. If we hadn't known where we were going, it wouldn't have been quite so bad, you know. But we docked after 5 days in Greenock, Scotland, and we were transported directly through the British Isles on train and loaded on another boat for an overnight crossing of the Channel to Le Havre. At Le Havre, we boarded those, someone mentioned them, 48 cars, and I think it was maybe Charlie Staff. You know, they were left over from World War I, and 40 men or 8 horses, that's the way it was. But we weren't really all that crowded, but it's the first time we began to see the devastation of war. Through every town that we passed and every freight yard that we went through. When we finally arrived at the end of the track where they hadn't been repaired yet, we boarded trucks. I have a lot of respect for those Army 6x6s because I've seen them in mud up to their axle, and they just keep right on going. Of course, most of the time we're going across country because there wasn't, I don't think I ever remember seeing a bridge. Now, before I wind up real quickly, the highlight of any day was when we got our mail call from back home. My mother sent me a 4-leaf clover one time, and I carried that in my wallet for 45 years. Well, 5 years ago, it was all dried out and broken, and I took it out of my wallet, and I separated it into 2 equal stacks. I figured it must be lucky. So I framed each half in a little frame, and now half of it sits on my daughter's mantel in Houston, Texas, and my son's bookcase in Boston, Massachusetts. So I hope it brings them the same luck that I've had over the years. Now, when we wrote letters home, there were always censors that read our mail because they thought we would give away some terrible secret. We didn't know anything. In fact, half the time we were lost. We couldn't tell. Some fellas fooled the censors, some fellas didn't. There was a censor by the name of Captain T.M. Britton that once read the following poem in a letter to a fellow sweetheart that was meant for him. And he kept it after all these years. I'd like to read you this letter because it's kind of a clever one. I've got a girl so far away and she is sweet and frail. But how can I send my love to her when the censor reads my mail? The girl is oh so very sweet. I love her willy-nilly. But how can I tell her of my love when it print? It looks so silly. I hate the thought of those tender words being read by strangers' eyes, the soul-writ words for her alone, the lies and alibis. So read my letters gently, sir. They are not meant for you, but for a girl so far away, I scrawled this silly goo. But when you read my letter, sir, and chuckle with delight, remember, sir, that another censor may laugh at the letters you write. The Ink Spots were one of the biggest names on the jukebox in those days. The Ink Spots made records right up until the 1980s, but it wasn't the same Ink Spots that was during the war. In fact, one of the Ink Spots, I can't remember his name offhand, I think it was Jones, died even in 1944, and he had to be replaced by another one of the Ink Spots brothers. Anyway, this is one of the big records. And you know, a while ago I mentioned about how music could bring back memories. Whenever I hear this song, I always think of my mother because this is one of her favorite songs. You remember this one? All of their songs started out the same way. I don't care what the name of it was.
Our rose must remain with the sun and the rain, or its lovely promise won't come true. To each his own, to each his own, and my own is you. What good is the song if the words just don't belong, and the dream must be a dream for two? No good alone to eat.
Well, this is finishing up. I'm going to go ahead because, like I say, it's getting late. I was finally assigned to the 36th Infantry Division. Now, that's the old Texas National Guard, and before the war, they were stationed at Camp Bowie, Texas. Now, they had been through a lot before I joined them. They were at landing at Salerno and Anzio in Italy, also the Battle of Monte Cassino, and then I know that this is far away. They went from Italy. There were still forces going up through the Alps, but it was tough going, so they decided to bypass that. The 36 came up here and landed on the Riviera in southern France, and they headed north. Now, just after they crossed the Moselle River is where I joined them, and we proceeded on north and crossed the German border and took over the town of Kaiserslautern. Now, at that point, all of the land west of the Rhine River was in Allied hands. Of course, there were other groups up here. There was a Canadian division. There was a 7th Army here somewhere, I don't know. Patton had his 3rd Army here somewhere in the south. There was an English division up here. But what we did was we headed straight south after we crossed the border, through Heilbronn, through Augsburg, through Landsberg. Landsberg is where Hitler spent some time in prison and wrote the infamous book, Mein Kampf. And we got down into the mountains of the Alps, and even though it was May, the going was pretty tough. There were still deep snowdrifts in the mountain passes. And we divided up into regiments. There were 3 regiments in the division. Our regiment went straight south, the others moved over to the east, and the last one went south and then hooked around. And then the most wonderful thing happened. The Germans surrendered. The war was over, at least for we people in the European theater. I better let that finish, or that's going to be the first thing we hear, right? Thank you, fellas. The war being over, they sent us back to a little town called Oberginsburg. It was a beautiful town. On a clear day, you could look out to the south and you could see the snow-capped Alps in the distance. Beautiful. It was rolling hills down here, and we were billeted in German homes. They just posted signs on the door, told the German civilians what they had to be out of this house by a certain time, and the only thing they could take was their personal belongings. So we lived quite comfortable. We had our one battalion was here where the other battalions were. I have no idea. We were scattered all over Kingdom Come. Now our duty there was threefold. We were supposed to collar any German soldiers that had discarded their uniforms for civilian clothes, especially SS troopers. We were supposed to find if we could find some displaced persons, we were supposed to locate them in camps until they could be repatriated home. And the third one, this was a big mistake on the Army's part. South of town, there was a big wine cellar, and we were supposed to guard it. Now, this was like asking the cat to guard the mouse, or the mouse to guard the cheese. This wine cellar, completely underground, there must have been, six rooms, probably half the size of our gymnasium out here, with hundreds of thousands of bottles of wine. We soldiers thought we had died and gone to heaven. I had a stroke of good luck at this point. The chaplain needed an assistant, one who could play the piano and the organ, and I fit the bill, and from then on it was smooth sailing. However, the Army was setting up a point system of who's to go home first. Well, I hadn't been overseas as long as most of the fellows, so my points were not much. So I was in the Army occupation, and they moved us for some reason every 30 days. We went from over Ginsburg up to Langenau, back to Ulm, up to Darmstadt, up to Michaelbach, up to Weilburg, and back to Swedish Hall. By the time we got here, I'd had my fill of movement. You know how it is. Well, the chaplain I was with was a Lutheran. He was in the Missouri Synod. And he had enough points to go home, so I drove him to Paris, and he went home. And when I got back, I said, this is all my chaplain's assistant duties. And I got out of that office, and I went into personnel in the headquarters company. Now, I stayed there for 9 months until I got enough points to go home. I might tell you one funny story about a chaplain. When you would type a letter for a chaplain at the end, where he signed his name, it said chaplain, C-H-A-P period. And then his name, let's say James Pennington. Then his rank, captain, C-A-P-T period. And then his denomination. Now, like I say, my chaplain, the last one I had was a Lutheran in the Missouri Synod. This one chaplain's assistant worked for a Catholic. Now, out here at the college, you know these Catholic priests are of the order of precious blood, and they abbreviate it CPPS. I don't know what that stands for, but I assume it's Latin of some kind. Anyway, this chaplain was the order of St. Sebastian, and you abbreviated OSB. Well, one day he came in and he laid the letter down on the assistant's desk and said, Sergeant, are you trying to tell me something? The sergeant read the letter, and all of a sudden his face turned red. He had printed, Chaplain, James Pennington, Captain, S.O.B. You thought that coming, didn't you? All right, to make a long story short, I finally got enough points. They took us into Stuttgart, and by train we went all the way up to Bremerhaven. We were finally going to go home. From Bremerhaven, we sailed down to the North Sea, through the English Channel, and we said goodbye England. We could see the tip here of England as we went by. But a day out in the sea, we blew a boiler. Well, this was disappointing. It was one of those Henry Kaiser, what do they call those ships? They're Liberty ship. It was the USS Texarkana. So we hobbled back in to Newport, South Wales. I wish I had time to talk about that for us. That's something else too. And we sat there for 5 days on the ship. A lot of fellas lost money playing dice, I know, during that time. Until the next victory ship came along, the SS Stevens, which took us home. We had kind of a rough crossing, but that's another story too. But have you ever had the kind of a thrill that sent chills over your whole body, made goosebumps raise on you, tears in your eyes? Well, I've had 3 such thrills as that, and one of them was that day when we sailed into New York Harbor. Now, the Statue of Liberty was there, and she was green. This was before she was renovated in I think it was 1986. She looked more beautiful to me than those creatures in that swimsuit edition, you know. Sports Illustrated. As we sailed in the harbor, there were scores of ships tied out into the harbor, and each one blew their horn as we sailed by. Got into the dock, there was a band playing, and they shipped us quickly to a camp in Virginia. I don't remember anymore what the name of that camp was, to their traditional steak dinner. I want to tell you one real, well, I'm talking a long time here. I got to tell you this one funny story, though, because why I like small towns. When we got into that camp in Virginia, I called my mother and dad and told them that I was home safely. Then I was going to call my sister. My sister lived in a little town of about 800 people. And the center of the town came in with 5 streets, 5 points they call it, just like down here at the Historical Museum, except the streets were much wider. On one corner was the drugstore, and next to it was a house. Now, it was common in those days for the switchboard in the center, in the county seat, to sublet a little switchboard. Maybe if you've seen the Waltons ever, Mary Ellen, and they put the switchboard in the lady's front room, and she had to hire people to man this thing. You know, it would buzz, and they'd put a plug in, say number please, and then they'd tell the number, and they'd take the corresponding plug and plug it in over here and then ring it. Well, anyway, I'll bet that operator in Virginia must have thought we were real corn huskers out here, because I could hear the 2 operators calling. And the operator in this little town says, "I'm sorry, nobody answered." But she said, "I saw him drive across 5 points a while ago." She says, "I think this is their bridge night, and I think it's over at the Pritchard's house. Let me ring over to the Pritchards and see if they're there." Well, sure enough, my sister was there. That's what I love about small towns. Well, to make a long story short, they sent us to Fort Sheridan up north of Chicago when I was a free man. They tried their best to keep us in the reserves, and I've made 3 wise decisions in my life. And one of them was to say, I do not want to be in the reserves because I'm sure as shooting, I bet you I'd been in Korea before it was over with. The second wise decision was coming to Rensselaer. And the third wise decision was saying yes was Marshall proposed. I'm going to play for you a little while, and I'm going to play from memory. If I forget, well, you'll forgive me. I think we're all friends here. But these are all my favorite songs, and I would like to have talked about each one, but time won't permit it. All right, see if you remember these. Heart is near somebody else, something like that, right? Oh. And then here's a real tearjerker. Planning on doing this one, but he requested it. Well, anyway. were two songs that was big down in Texas. There was a little restaurant called the Fiesta. All the Fiesta burgers, they were delicious. But anyway, the two pieces they played the most were Deep in the Heart of Texas, and this one written by Cole Porter. This is said to be the most perfect love song ever written. And because it's my last song, because it's been such a nice audience, I'm going to give it a great big Hollywood ending on it. Gosh, I did this an hour and a half at home. I must have talked quite a bit in between. The ladies have some nice refreshments for you back there, and there'll be 6 more numbers here while you're visiting and having.
Until tomorrow, 99. Oh, what sweet sorrow
to be parting, dear, from you, with a farewell kiss or two. Good night.
chasing a couple of dreamers, and there you are. Lovers hail the moonlight cocktail. Now add a couple of flowers, a drop of dew. Stir for a couple of hours till dreams come true. As to the number of kisses, it's up to you. Moonlight cocktails need a few. Cool it in the summer breeze. Serve it in the starlight underneath the trees. Discover tricks like these are sure to make your moonlight cocktail please. Follow the simple directions and they will bring life of another complexion where you